Welcome to Reboot Republic, the podcast that goes behind the headlines and looks at the big issues in this republic of inequality. We are the podcast of solutions and the podcast of hope, and I'm delighted to be joined back in the pod by Louise Bayliss, who is a very regular in this podcast, great friend, and head of policy and social justice at St Vincent De Paul, SVP Ireland. Louise, it's great to have you back in the pod again.
Great to be here. Thanks, Rory.
So I suppose this week what we wanted to chat about was the ongoing cost of living crisis and what you're seeing in terms of SVP and the experiences people are having, and I suppose some of the kind of policies you think should be done. And also, I wanted to talk to you about the latest homelessness figures as well. We are seeing now, we are seeing, and people obviously would very well aware of this, record homelessness numbers, and particularly, it's children, families, individuals. So we just want to talk a bit about that, and I suppose generally just where things are going in terms of the country broadly, Louise, reflecting where we're
Mm,
at and, in terms of your work and what you're seeing and what people are feeling, because I think there's a lot of, how to describe it, I think a sense of uncertainty, almost disorientation amongst people out there, this real sense of it feels like things were built on sand to a certain extent and where are things going. Maybe just start generally, like your sense with how people are feeling, and we know a lot of people are struggling, but what's your sense of where the country is at? Your take,
Yeah,
Louise.
yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, Rory, because obviously I'm surrounded with people who are suffering. We're hearing the calls. We're looking at people really, really struggling, people who wouldn't have been struggling before. And then I meet some other people and they've actually questioned me saying, is this cost of living crisis just an exaggeration? Are people really feeling it? And I think there are two different types of people in Ireland at the moment, those who really are unaffected by any of this, and those who are really struggling. And I always think, and I'm very lucky. I own my own house with a big mortgage, I'll grant you. But I have the stability of owning my own house. I don't have any health issues myself. My child has no special needs or additional needs, and I have a job. So based on that, that's like winning the lottery in Ireland at the moment. When you have all those things in place, it's a really good functioning country if you have those. But if any one of those things fall by the wayside, whether it's you have a child who's waiting for an assessment of needs or waiting for speech and language therapy or waiting for a hospital appointment, that fear you have, if you are struggling with housing precarity, if you can't work because the cost of childcare is too much and your wages are too low, all of those things, it's a different world. And it's really important that people understand that for some people, the struggle is really, really real. And that's not the society I want to live in.
Yeah, and I think I suppose I was thinking about this, that there are two Irelands. Indeed, there are many, many Irelands right now going on with, particular groups struggling really, really hard, as you mentioned. Whether it's in terms of, we know disabled people particularly suffered. No other group really suffered like it in terms of cuts in the last budget. Obviously the energy credits were cut across the board, and support payments, but particularly for disabled people, who face that, and have always had a higher cost of
Yeah.
living, and then, been within a cost of living crisis, and now the most recent one. So, they're one group, as you say, who are particularly affected. And then we know, as well, for example, lone parents, one parent
Yeah.
family, particularly again.
Oh, we've a new group. We've new group coming in, which is really surprising. We have older adults living alone. So the over
Yeah.
65s living alone, their consistent poverty rate in the self data that came out earlier this month went up by 85%. So their consistent poverty rate is 9.6, twice as much as it would be for the general population. So there are definitely groups, and as you quite rightly highlighted, people on a disability were really suffering. They lost about €1,400 last year. And while the government has said that they're extending the fuel allowance for the 4 weeks, which works out at €152, um, that €152 doesn't even bring them back to where they were last year. So if we just look at the fuel allowance alone, because that's what the government have decided to do to support people in this current energy crisis, if we look at that alone, last year the fuel allowance increased by €5 a week over the time span of the fuel allowance. That worked out at €140 for the whole year. Later on, so that was in October. In November, the National Energy Affordability Task Force produced a report, and that report said that the average household was going to see their energy costs increase by €321 for 2026. Now, that was before the current crisis. That was when things were relatively stable. So they were already facing, and anybody on a fuel allowance payment were already facing this shortfall of about €180 a year for their energy costs for 2026, just to bring them back to what 2025 was. And anybody will remember 2025 was a difficult time for people with energy costs. We saw soaring and arrears among families. So the €152 that the government is giving as their salvation is not even bringing people back to what they were at last year before the crisis. And I think that's what we need to look at.
Yeah, I think you're right to point that out in terms of the kind of that, I suppose, gap between what the government are saying that they're doing is sufficient. And it's interesting, again, in the Dáil debates and discussions around this, constantly what they point out is they say, for example, when we raised the issue, and it wasn't just us, it was Joan Carty from the Irish Wheelchair Association saying, disabled people were having to choose between heating and eating. I know I've talked about this a number of times in the podcast since the minister said this in the Dáil, that this was misleading to suggest this. And because people can go to the community welfare officer and that's there, and that, there was a criticism of opposition because they were acting as if these supports weren't there. And maybe you could talk a little bit, because that the role of the community welfare officer, and just because they're there and they can provide additional supports doesn't mean people get them.
Exactly. It doesn't mean they could get them. And the very fact that they're saying go to it, there's obviously a need for it. So, increase the payment and withdraw that instead of having to get some people to go looking for those additional payments. Just give them the amount that they is needed. That would be the simple thing. The other side, I would reject quite strongly that argument that people aren't choosing between heating and eating. That is not our experience in SVP. So, for instance, last year we had over 260,000 calls from people looking for help. 260,000, unprecedented level of request for assistance. And if we break that down so we can see that
Yeah.
level of need, when our members, and we're very fortunate, our members are very privileged to go in to see people's homes, they do the home visitations. When they're going in there, they are often confronted by households who have either electricity or being cut off, or else they're trying to struggle with food. And in many cases, and this is what's reported to us a lot of times, they go into homes, especially on pay as you go meters, where people are running out of money before the end of the week, before they get their payment. And what's happening to those people, they're going in, they're self disconnecting for 1 or 2 days a week, maybe on a bad week when some other payment has come due, and they're left without electricity. Now, we hear all the time the CRU is telling us, engage with your supplier. There's all these protections around you for winter to make sure you're not disconnected. We have the report that shows who's not being connected because they're engaging, but we have no data on who is self-disconnecting because they just don't have the money. And many times members have said they've gone to houses where they've been got a request for help for food. They go out with food vouchers, little vouchers or whatever they're going out for. But when they get there, they find the family have no electricity or they've no gas, and it's a regular occurrence. And the problem with that is, Rory, we don't have any data. CRU is not asking the providers to give that information. That's the job of a regulator, to have that information. We talk about, the 320,000 households are in energy arrears, going up higher to 360,000. We talk about that. We're not actually seeing the full picture until we find out how many people are sitting at home because they ran out of €5 for their meter. They use the €20 emergency credit and there's nothing left to give. Or they may have the electricity. This is another case that we see quite often. They have the electricity, but they know they're watching their meter. They've got €7 to last them 2 days. They're not having showers. They're using minimal use. All of that. They're going to libraries to keep warm. All of that is real, and it's what we're seeing on the ground with people.
And that is so important to highlight that, as you said, 250,000 calls, 250,000 people contacted SVP last year to look for support. That shows that there's inadequate supports there. Those people weren't contacting
Absolutely.
for the crack. It takes,
Yeah.
as we've talked about so many times, to overcome stigma, to overcome, a sense of failure, to pick up the phone or to email or whatever it is, to look for
Yeah.
support. People are in a desperate situation to get to that, and that's 250,000, which shows the gap between the supports given by the state and the reality of people's lives.
And I think it comes back to your point going, why would you send somebody to CWO if you know the payment is inadequate? Why force them? Why waste their time? Why humiliate them? Why send them to a CWO office where they have, it's not a rights based, it's not an entitlement. It depends. Did you get support earlier on in the year because your fridge broke? Are you going to be entitled to it now because you've already been supported? That's not rights based. And in a republic, we should have a right to declare that every citizen has a roof over their head and food on the table. They're the basic minimums. And when we talked about the 260,000, 130, over 130,000 of those requests for assistance were for food. For food.
That's just, again, it shows, that serious situation people are in when they're requesting for food. And we know there are food banks operating across the country and, very significant work being done. But that is the reality. People need food. They can't afford food in this country, in one of the wealthiest countries
Yeah.
in the world.
Well, I would even talk about, there's been a huge debate, as you know, about the extension of the rollout for hot meals. And I would share concerns about, the waste of some of the packaging, the quality of the food, all of that needs to be looked at. However, there's another report that shows the health behavior of school children. And the most recent data from that in 2022 showed 18% of children have gone to school or gone to bed hungry because of lack of food in their home. Almost 1 in 5 children have gone to bed or school hungry. So if, we definitely need to improve the quality, we definitely need to make sure we're getting value for money. All of that needs to happen. But what we can't do is prevent those 18% of children not getting that hot meal. That may be the only hot meal they're getting that day.
And those figures are stark. And again, you mentioned earlier the CSO data that came out for 2025, the Silk data, and I actually went
Yeah.
through it just to see in terms of that impact on the different groups, and we talked about it there. And that figure there that you got, it was that from the Silk data in terms of, or where was that data from in terms of that?
The the 18% of children going to
Yes,
school
who were
hungry.
going to school
That
hungry.
comes from the health behavior of school children report. So that's a report that was last done in 2022, and it said at that stage, and that 18% of children in that last year had gone to bed either hungry or gone to school hungry.
Yeah, and that figure is I'd say, in terms of accuracy, absolutely accurate still today, and is probably slightly higher because I was just
I
looking at
would,
the
yeah, I would imagine slightly higher, but it's a worrying figure, and that's why when every time I hear about the debate about the hot school meals, and I share so many of the concerns, but I also think of the 1 in 5, almost 1 in 5 children going to bed hungry. So that's really where
it.
my objective would come from.
Absolutely, and when we look at the deprivation rate, I was just looking at it for children, in 2025, it was 19.6% of children were living in families with deprivation. So that means that whether it was unable to heat the home, unable to afford a meal, unable to afford clothes, again, it's the same figure, 1 in 5 children.
Yeah, but it's even more stark than that for lone parent children in lone parent
Yeah,
households. The figures showed 48.6% of one parent families, their children were living in deprivation. 48
yeah.
point, almost half. of
Yeah,
the children. And that's for working lone parents, for everything included in that. Almost half of them are living with deprivation. So
yeah.
really scary figures. And we know the impact that has on long term, on children, on their futures and on their ability. And that's before we even look at the most egregious form of poverty, I feel, for children, where they don't even have the security of their own roof. They don't have a kitchen table to do their homework, or a bed that's a bed, not doubling up as a takeaway dinner table.
Yeah, and we've spoken so many times about that, and just the other figure, the last figure from that latest Silk data showed that they also provide this figure, which after housing costs are paid for,
Oh
what
my God,
the
20.5%. And then, yeah,
it's 27.9%. 27.9% of children are in families who are suffering deprivation after housing costs are paid for. That's almost 1 in 3.
yeah, yeah.
And that's the reality that people are in. They're literally, and it's a massive number
Yeah,
of
but it actually, one of the things that really has struck me is they do it at risk of poverty before and after housing costs.
mm,
And they look at, you would imagine the group that would be most supported are the group who are in receipt of HAP because they're getting the help towards it. But
yeah,
because they should be entitled to social housing, they've been assessed by the state of being in need of social housing, and they really are in the private rental sector paying top ups. Their at risk of poverty rate is 20.5% before housing costs, and it goes up over 50%. It's, I think, about 58% after their housing costs. So, what should be, being entitled to HAP tells you it's already a marker that you're at risk of poverty. Um, but then to find out that actually the leverage that's supposed to lift you out of poverty is actually compounding your poverty and putting more of you at risk of poverty is quite stark as well. And it just shows you that the HAP system is not suitable replacement for social housing when people are left with these top ups that they should not be paying.
yeah, absolutely. And again, it's something that we've both highlighted for many years. That issue that so many people in receipt of the housing assistance payment are paying these top ups, and as you say, because they're paying additional top ups, and they also pay what's called the differential rent to the council. And
Exactly.
now,
Yeah.
where you have councils like Dublin City Council that have increased the rent, those HAP tenants are disproportionately affected because they're
Yeah, and that's, yeah, and like, in, if you wanted to make the argument, and Dublin City of councillors have made the argument that they need that extra revenue in to do renovations on properties, that the properties need to be maintained. However, they're charging differential rates and top ups to HAP tenants who are not going to get their social housing renovated. They're not going to be entitled to the benefit of those extra rent. So where was the fairness in that? Why wasn't it taken into account they're already paying a landlord top up? Why should they pay a higher rent to the council so the council can renovate a property that they can't even access?
it's very unfair. And as you said already, their rate of poverty, is so high, and that's 60,000 households are
Yeah,
living in the private rental sector in receipt of the housing assistance payment. And I would be very worried for the impact of those rent increases on them. And of
yeah.
course, a significant proportion are one parent families or people with disabilities. And increasingly, as you mentioned, that group of older people who are stuck in the
Older
private rent.
people living alone. Yeah, it's older people living alone are a group that really has shot up over the last couple of years. It's quite stark. So it's, when we talk about pensioners and they talk about giving increases in pension, like, look at the evidence. It's not all pensioners. If, some pensioners, and I'm not saying make pensioners, live in poverty, but what I would be saying is, instead of giving, well, if it's not affordable, of giving every pensioner who's living comfortably an extra tenner, look at the people living alone, where 1 in 10 of them are living in consistent poverty at the moment. Use the living alone allowance leverage. Make sure the money's directed to them. Like, make sure that we're using targeted supports and supporting those who are really in need of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of then, I suppose, that question of society and what type of society we are creating when we have now, it's almost 5,500 children homeless, 5,457 children. And I actually
Yeah.
remember it was 2016 when Erica Fleming stood outside who was homeless at the time with her child, stood outside the GPO, and of course it was the 100 years anniversary of the proclamation, the rising, and I was with her at the time. I remember thinking, the homelessness at that point, I think it was in the region of 2,000, maybe 2,500. Be corrected on that, but it was a far, far cry away from 5,500.
Oh,
And
completely. Yeah, no, complete. I remember a couple of years before that, maybe just even a year and a half before that, around 2014, 2015, and homelessness was hovering just under the 1,000 level. And even like Ryan Tubridy on the Late Late was going, it looks like next month we are going to have 1,000 children in this country homeless. And there was outrage all over the country that this would, it was Late Late show status. It was that
yeah,
important and that high and that really concerning. And it was like, are we going to actually ever reach 1,000 children homeless in Ireland? And we reached it not once, but twice, but three times, or four times, or five times. Are we going to let it get to 6,000? Like, we don't seem to have that outrage we did when it was getting to 1,000. And there seems to be this almost attitude that, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so we can just accept it. And I don't accept that. I don't accept that. If you look, it seems an awful lot of um, families, and it is an awful lot of families. It's over 2,000, it's nearly 2,500 families in emergency accommodation. But we hear all the time that social housing is coming online. And so, and we had almost 8,000 social housing units last year or the year before. We're getting this on stream. So why do we still have 2,500 households? In one fell swoop of the pen, we could move those families out of emergency accommodation. I know it's not that simple. I know there's more coming in, and I know we have to have better prevention. And, there's loads of things we could do about that. Like even something stupid like the homeless hub. Did you know? I mean, one of the great reforms they said was that tenants would get longer notice periods of eviction to find their homes. However, to access homeless HAP, you can only get that 3 months out from your eviction date. Now, how are you going to find a property in 3 months?
yeah, yeah.
Like, why not, when you get your eviction notice, be told? Because you're not going to find a property in affordable on anything but homeless help. Even that you're going to struggle. But why are you giving people 3 months instead of bringing it out to 6 months or bringing it out to when they get their eviction notice? Simple things like that could make a difference. It just feels like we could, and we saw it. The frustrating thing is, and I know you know this, Rory, we saw that during COVID, we saw family homelessness. The very things we called for, the policy solutions we called for, were implemented during a health crisis, and they made an impact. They worked. Like, we know the proof that's working. And then we lifted the eviction ban and we did other things, and we see it going straight, because a lot of that time people were moved into Airbnbs where
Mm,
Airbnb landlords couldn't get in, so they gave their properties to them. We saw the impact of not just the eviction ban, but the lifting of Airbnbs being used for hotels instead of families, and families in hotels instead of homes. We saw that impact, and we saw it worked. And we've gone straight back as if we haven't learned anything at all from it.
and it's incredible, like, because that ban on evictions, it really did prevent homelessness. And we look at it right now, like we have the highest evictions since the famine. And I keep repeating it because it doesn't seem to be entering the discussion, the narrative, the public debate, the
Yeah.
political debate that we had last year. Over 20,000 households were evicted. So, in terms of the numbers of people who are being made homeless, a lot of families, a lot of children, like thousands and thousands are being, pushed into homelessness. And I just
Yeah.
don't understand why they won't put in place an emergency ban on evictions. Like,
Yeah, and as you said, those 20,000 evictions, they might not have all ended up in emergency accommodation, but they
no.
were all very close to that point. They all had that fear. Children were going to school with knots in their stomach, wondering what was coming home. Parents were going through that trauma of it. It's not. so, I've come across people myself who at the last minute were lucky enough to find emergency accommodation, but regardless, they were traumatized afterwards, packing bags where they didn't know where they were going. Just horrendous to get that eviction notice and not have anywhere to go.
And it just it again, that question of the normalization of it, and we've seen that, and I feel that part of the political discussion as well. This, and we hear it from the Taoiseach even saying, every time the figures going, the homelessness is complex. There's complex causes, and of course, you read between the lines on that. We know, like, it is victim blaming essentially. Like,
But that's it. I mean, I have to be honest. You know, I just hear this whole thing about, we need to look at mental health supports, supports for addiction, supports for this. That is all true. And that's always been an issue around homelessness. But for the majority of families, it's nothing to do with mental health supports or addiction issues. It's economic poverty that's driving them to it. Lack of supply, fair enough as well. But basically, the
and
ones who are left from, yeah, the evictions, but then not having, evictions are caused sometimes by poverty, by falling
yeah,
into arrears because you can't afford the top up. If there is an economic reality, or then, being evicted because you could afford the house you were in and then trying to get out into the open market where it's much more competitive, and you can say, I to get this house, I'd need to be paying 400 extra a month. I don't have it. And I can't find anything within the price range. That economic part of poverty and of homelessness seems to be left out of the discussion because, as you said, if you use that in the discussion, you're now talking about you cannot blame these people. You can't blame them. This is a society that is allowing somebody work full time, not being able to put a roof over their head, or being locked out of work because they can't afford childcare that affords them to be able to pay for childcare, pay for their bills, and keep a roof over their head, being pushed into poverty, like being pushed into poverty because of those type of barriers, especially, I have to say it, but it's true for lone parents where they really have very little options going. And that is something that really is getting to me at this stage because I look when I look years ago when when people were in Spark and we were talking about our options, and for many people, working was, even though social welfare was a life of poverty, working for many people would have been more poverty, because by the time you pay childcare, you might lose your medical card, you might have to lose your HAP, you might lose everything. You could be worse off working. And some of us chose to work, despite not being paid, it was costing us money to work, but we chose to work. And, there was decisions around that time. And some people quite rationally said, why would I go out to work and abandon my child to a creche when I'm not going to have any extra money. I'm leaving my child to not achieve anything. And they made a rational choice. And now I look at those women and they made the choice that the state forced onto them. But they're now like coming up, they're older. They've been 10, 15 years out of the workforce. They're going back into jobs now that their children are a bit older. They're going in at minimum wage. They're unlikely to ever get out minimum wage. Their whole life trajectory has been set out for them, a life of poverty. Instead of being supported during those years that they wanted the support, to allow them to continue to keep a foothold in the workforce, not work full time, but work your 20 hours a week. That wasn't allowed. And I mean, I keep going back. We are going backwards in some of our supports. So when one parent family allowance was introduced in 1997, it was introduced with an income disregard that was the equivalent of €146.50. Now, there was no minimum time wage when it was introduced, but a few years later there was. What it meant at that time when that was introduced, a lone parent could work, and we'll just say a minimum wage job, just for a reference point. Not that I want the people to be on minimum wage jobs, but just say we're looking at that point in 1997. A lone parent back then could work 26 hours a week and keep her full social welfare payment, to acknowledge that, there were additional costs of childcare and all of that. And she could work for 26 hours, hopefully when the child was at school, and really make that lift out of poverty. You look at it now, that income disregard, it's not 140, 650. It has gone up in the 30 years since 1997, or the 29 years. It's gone up from 140, 650 to €165. That does not keep in contact with inflation. And if we put it in real concrete terms, instead of being able to work 26 hours and keeping her full social welfare, she's now able to work 12 hours to keep her social welfare. They're the real barriers that are facing women and children in those situations. So we are going backwards in the supports we're providing to people.
Yeah, I think it's so important that we get that analysis out there, that we communicate this, and highlight that that's the reality, because there is definitely a real pushback. I think in terms of these ideas that well, actually Ireland is a very good welfare state. We're very good in terms of Europe, and we provide a lot of support to people, and we have a quite a fair economic model. That's the argument, and that actually it's not economically sustainable to provide more supports. That what we really have to consider what we do now, that and it's actually it's very I suppose disregarding and ignoring that reality that you've just set out there, that actually we don't have people don't have the supports that they should have,
Yeah.
that they need to have a decent life, to have a dignified life. And again, it's this looking at this cost benefit idea that this is income supports are a cost rather than an investment in people, which you've just set out
That's
so clearly.
exactly it. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. Allowing somebody to continue to work, to make a life, escape poverty for their children while their children are small, but then ultimately for themselves as they grow up, as their children grow up, and as parents that have given so much for their children, that they have a route out of poverty as well. But at the moment, there's so little routes out of poverty. You choose what level, what poverty level you want, inward poverty or social welfare poverty. But either one, it's very clear that's the route you have for having a child.
And it links as well, I think, in, and maybe again to finish up, maybe kind of your reflection, as you're saying, we're now coming into, again, it's it's Easter weekend, another anniversary, or another year marking 1916, the proclamation, those aspirations of equality, and the question of the state and what type of state we've created. And when you reflect, you were, as you mentioned there, got involved around, Spark, the campaign for, single parents, or when the austerity cuts were happening. We've seen now we're probably, we're over 10 years since those kind of austerity, those intense austerity years. And some parts of core services haven't recovered, haven't been invested in the same way since then, have never recovered. But then we've seen this economic growth, this almost, second Celtic tiger. And within it, we still have inequality, the levels of poverty. There's been no dramatic fall in child poverty, for example.
No. Well, you just mentioned child poverty, so I'll give you an example of child poverty. So, as we know, there was a slight drop overall in the CSO consistent poverty rates for the general population of 0.03%. It was very small, 0.3%. For child poverty. So last year, if we look at the Silk data, it was 5% for the general population, and for children, it was 8.5%. And this year, it went down to 4.7 for the general population, and it went down to from 8.5% to 7.8% for children. That sounds okay. We're going the right direction. However, However, this is the really big thing. For children in one parent families, their consistent poverty rate last year was 11%. And for children in two parent families with up to three children, their consistent poverty rate was 6%. So slightly above the general population, but almost half of what it was for children in one parent families. So we see a drop in the Silk data in 2026, and you hope that it's experienced by every child in the country. And that would be my hope, that every child sees a material benefit in their welfare. But what actually happened was children in two parent families dropped below the general population. They're now at 4.2% from 6%. So they had a big drop, which was great. Delighted to see any child getting that opportunity. Really good news. Really happy about that. Really positive. But what you are seeing is that children in one parent families, their consistent poverty went up by 13.4%. So 13.2%. So what you're seeing is one group dropping and one group going higher. So if we look at children and their different poverty levels, a child in a one parent family is 2.79 times, nearly 3 times higher likely to live in consistent poverty. They are 4 times higher likely to live in deprivation. Their deprivation rates are 4 times higher, and their um, at risk of becoming homeless is 4 times higher than a child in a 2 parent family. These are stats. So we say that we value every child equally, but we are accepting a society where, based on the relationship status of a parent, based on not enforcing child maintenance, based on all of these things, we are accepting that one group of children are 3 times more likely to live in consistent poverty, 4 times more likely to experience homelessness, and 4 times more likely to experience deprivation. We cannot claim that we treat all children equally when we have those stats there as our symbol of shame.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely, Louise. And I think it's so important, again, to highlight it, to discuss it, to set that out, because those average figures disguise so much of what is the reality for groups within that. And I think that's kind of what I'm seeing in terms of, Irish society and what's happening. We're almost becoming splintered. And it's like, as you said, it's the Ireland of halves, this whatever percentage it is, 20%, 15%, um, doing very, very well and not feeling cost of living. And then, bottom 30, 40% struggling, a middle there that's struggling as well. And it's really this kind of the kind of masking or just kind of burying to some extent of like what is going on in this unequal Ireland and unequal republic, and the need to continuously highlight the light, shine the light on what is actually happening for those different groups who are experiencing and struggling.
Totally agree with you, Rory. But I would add something. It's not just all about income, although obviously income is a massive thing, and I'm always talking about income and poverty and all of that.
Mm.
But it's also for people who need services. So, if you don't need services, the system seems to be working. If you have your own house and you don't need services. But if you have a child with autism, if you have a child with speech and language therapy, if you yourself need back surgery and you're on a public waiting list, all of those services that should be paid for by our taxes are lacking. And it's so even people who are on paper doing okay, if they're paying for those therapeutic supports for their child, they're paying for expensive private health because they need to access medical care. If they have a parent who needs care and they're looking at the family home that they own being used to pay off nursing fees, all of that is where even people who think they're doing relatively okay, one part of the system that breaks down and you rely on the state services, you'll see a very different country.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so many people experience that, and that issue of the waiting lists, having to pay privately. And again, that's the other part of our state, our welfare state, our social democratic state that isn't, working, that those services aren't there in terms of, equal access, and you have the private versus public. And that is so, again, that's back to investment and chronic underinvestment over time and the questions of our social policy and how it's organized. But listen, Louise, thanks so much again for chatting. And of course, I always want to highlight the great work that's been done by the St Vincent De Paul. And as you say, thousands and thousands of volunteers who give their time and are kind of covering up the cracks that are there, helping people through.
Well, I'll give you a concrete example, Rory. SVP gave 41 million in direct supports to people.
41 million, and that's coming from donations from people, and then the work being done in terms of the volunteers and supporting people. And so listen, thank you for all the work that you and all the volunteers in the organization do. It's so important. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Rory.
Thanks, Louise. As always, Louise, great to have you on. Director Policy, Head of Social Policy and Social Justice with SVP. And thanks, Louise. And we will have you back again, of course, given this cost of living crisis is absolutely, unfortunately, worsening. Listen, thanks to Tony for producing, for tolerating all the glitches we had at the start, for recovering. And thank you all for listening. And please, if you can, share the podcast around, let people know you're listening. And also, if you are interested, of course, you can always contact Tony about becoming a patron and keeping his and this show on the road. We'll talk to you all soon. Slán go fóill.